Again, today's topic of emotional intelligence, we're specifically dealing with empathy and social skills, kind of dealing with them as one. But let's look at empathy. I think we all have a good idea of what empathy is, but I'm going to throw out some definitions, and we're going to go from there. And there's different types of empathy that we're going to break down. I have some examples that I want to share, just some stories I want to share, and I think it will be beneficial. So empathy. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the thoughts or feelings of another, okay? It's the action, and I like that word, the action of understanding, I love this definition, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience of another. And I think what I like most about that definition is it starts with the action of understanding. Because I think some people think there's a part of us that's empathetic by nature that we're going to talk about. But there's a part of it that requires action and can be developed, and we can do something about it. So I love that definition because it's the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience of another. So that is empathy. Another definition is the ability to share someone else's feelings or experiences by imagining what it would be like to be in the other person's situation. I think that would be so helpful to us. I just want to make sure everybody, when you're on the call, make sure you're muting your phone so that we can get a clear call for those who are listening. So anybody besides me that's not speaking, just make sure that your phone is muted. Thank you so much. Truly appreciate it. But you just want to experience or imagine what it would be like in somebody else's situation. You know, I think if we had more empathy, we would be slower to judge, slower to criticize, slower to dismiss and downplay. If you just for a minute thought, I wonder what it's like to be in that person's situation. And I think that would help us all with our interpersonal relationships on a one-on-one level and communally, I'll say that. Let me also put this forth. To feel and display empathy, it's not necessary to share the same experiences or circumstances as someone else, okay? So a lot of times we think I can't be empathetic because I'm not that person. I didn't experience that. I don't know what they're going through. You don't have to have the exact same cookie cutter experience to be able to empathize with someone, okay? So you don't have to have the shared experience or circumstance. But empathy is an attempt to better understand the other person by getting to know their perspective. Again, going back to that definition that I like so much, there is an action required. So where it says empathy is an attempt to better understand the other person. So if you attempt to do something, there is effort and there is action that is required. So it's not just by osmosis. You just don't sit around and have empathy by doing nothing. There is some active work that is required. And so one of the things I realize in my personal life is sometimes our attempt to relate to somebody can come across as dismissive. Now, this may be just me, but I'm going to share some things that I think. Sometimes you'll share something with somebody and you'll tell them, oh, my goodness, you won't believe what happened today. This is how my day went. This happened, A, B, C, and D. And what you want as a response from a person that you are in a relationship with, whether it's a friendship, a marriage, a neighbor, whatever it is, whatever level of the relationship, what you're really looking for is some empathy. You want somebody to be able to share in your feelings, correct? That's what we do when we're communicating with others. We want them to be able to share in our feelings. But what happens a lot of times is we say, oh my goodness, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And then somebody says, you know what? Let me tell you what happened to me one time. This happened to me, so I know how you feel. No, the truth is you don't know how I feel. You know how you feel because all you did was try to to think about, and I know the attempt was empathy, but sometimes it comes across as dismissive because you didn't hear me. And we don't have the same experiences all the time. We can sometimes have similar experiences, but they're not the same. So sometimes when you're like, oh, this happened to me one time, you never heard the rest of my story. And I want to tell you my story. And I know for me personally, and I've said this before, I am not the most social person by nature. I have developed, hopefully, really solid social skills, and I'm continuing to work on it. But for me, I need to know that you're engaged and you are interested in what I'm telling you. So an indicator for me, and whether this is right or wrong, I'm just sharing from my personal space. An indicator for me is if you inquire and ask questions. Like if I say, oh, this happened to me today and it was terrible, and you're like, oh boy, that's bad. I do not continue. I do not continue to share because there may have been sympathy, but there was not empathy. And empathy just requires that there's a little bit of digging. Sometimes because of how I am, I don't like to talk on the phone and talk to people every day. So sometimes if something is going on and I feel it necessary to talk, because remember, to maintain that emotional intelligence and that balance, you have to communicate and share and talk certain things out. So sometimes, I'll send somebody a text or a message and I'll say, oh, today was a rough day. And that's my measurement on who I'm going to get empathy from, by the response. Sometimes people say, oh, I'm having a rough day too. Great. That wasn't helpful. I'm not telling you anything at all. I'm sorry that you're having a rough day. But at the same time, that was not helpful to me in any way. And it didn't dig in any deeper into allowing me to express my concerns. So sometimes I say I'm having a rough day and somebody says, oh, I'll be praying for you. Great. I love prayer, but what are you praying about? Because you don't know anything that happened. But okay, that's just me. But so part of empathy, that action, is listening and asking questions and getting to know a little more. Okay, so you want to dig in when we're talking about interpersonal relationships. You really want to make sure that if you have empathy and you're going to understand somebody's perspective, you've got to ask them questions. You've got to be engaged. You have to have active listening. That's one of the main actions that is required. All right, so I'm going to talk quickly about the 3 types of empathy that there are. And I don't know if it's just me. I'm hearing a little bit of background noise. So I just want everybody to double check and make sure that their phone is muted. I'm hearing a little something in the background. It could be my special phone or my earpiece, but please double check and see if your phone is muted. All right. So there are 3 types of empathy that we're going to talk about quickly. The first type of empathy is cognitive empathy. And what cognitive empathy is, it's just like it sounds. It's the ability to put yourself in someone else's place and see their perspective. A lot of the experts define this as perspective taking, okay? So you're taking someone else's perspective. And this is a very logical process. That's why it's called cognitive empathy. So you are thinking about, you are processing through your mental capacity, the ability to see somebody else's perspective. So there's not a lot of feeling involved. So when we talk about empathy in general, you generally think about feeling, but this cognitive approach doesn't really have any feeling involved, okay? So you want to be mindful of that. This is the cognitive empathy. It doesn't necessarily require engaging the emotions. You can see somebody's perspective without engaging emotions. There is a time and a place to do that where that is necessary. So it's more of empathy by thought rather than feeling. So it's a mental assent. You can think through and think about a process and then relate to a person, okay? So it's empathy by thought rather than feeling. That's cognitive empathy. Now, the negative side of cognitive empathy is that it can be seen as under-emotional. When we're looking for empathy or we're talking about empathy, we're looking for an emotional connection. We're looking to engage emotionally. So if it's only from a logical or an analytical point of view, it may come across as unsympathetic or even cold, okay? So you want to be mindful of that. Now, again, the good side of this, because it's necessary sometimes, those that have a strong cognitive empathy, they're very good at communicating needs and being able to actively listen and then to repeat and understand and comprehend and communicate those needs effectively. They're also excellent at negotiation and being able to, bring people to terms and resolve conflict. So those are good things about it. And it's so interesting because a lot of men will tend to have more cognitive empathy. Again, not a bad thing. They will tend to have more cognitive empathy because they're more logical thinkers than women are in general. Nobody be offended by anything I just said. I'm making a general statement that may or may not apply to you. But men are generally logical thinkers. So when they hear something, they can relate to it. They'll think through it and they'll mentally process it. And the empathy that they express may seem under emotional, and it may even result in conflicts, or your spouse or your partner or your significant other or your friend saying, you're not hearing my needs, you're not hearing my feelings and my emotions. But the one party, because they're a cognitive empathizer, is like, I totally understand what you're saying. I totally see your perspective. All that's missing is a little bit of the emotion, because the cognitive empathy does not really engage our emotions. So we want our emotions engaged when we're dealing with empathy. The second type of empathy, that was cognitive empathy. The second type of empathy is emotional empathy, okay? It's the ability to readily understand and feel the emotions of others. This is all kind of referred to as emotional contagion. Like, these emotions are contagious. I know it happens with me. Like, if I see somebody crying, if it's somebody that I love, sometimes I don't even need to know why they're crying, and tears will start to flow from my eyes because of that emotional empathy. It's that emotional contagion. It's contagious. And don't even get me talking about movies, things that I watch and somebody's going through something and it's contagious, right? So you're literally feeling those emotions of the other person right alongside them, as if those emotions have been caught. Okay, so it's not a mental response like cognitive empathy. It's like, not like you thought through it. You saw it and you responded because you felt the same thing. Now, to be clear, emotional empathy is really our first natural response. Okay. If you'll see it with mothers and babies. A mother can look at a baby and smile. The baby will smile. They don't know why they're smiling, or And if you've ever worked in like childcare or a nursery, if a baby cries, if you work in a nursery and you've got 8 babies, you got to keep those babies from crying, because if one baby cries, all the other babies will start to cry, because it's that natural, emotional, empathetic response. My sister and brother, I have 3 brothers, but my sister and one of my brothers are twins. And my mother used to tell stories about how my brother never, ever cried, except for when my sister cried for kind of an extended period of time. So if my sister needed something and she didn't get it and she started crying, and for a period of time, then my brother would cry. Once my mother dealt with my sister, my brother was fine. Once my sister stopped crying, my brother didn't cry. So it's just that emotional empathy. And again, they have that Wonder Twin power activating thing going on too. But it's that emotional empathy, and babies naturally have that. They respond to their environment. If you've ever seen a baby that has been in a atmosphere where there's a lot of yelling and screaming, the baby is fearful all the time. You go to touch the baby, they flinch. All those things are that emotional empathy. So that's kind of our first natural response, okay? Now, the negative side of the emotional empathy, if that's your leading empathetic nature, is that you can be overwhelmed by emotions and then you're unable to respond. So if you get overwhelmed, if you see somebody crying and then you start crying and somebody actually needs to do something, but we're both crying and we both are beyond our capacity to move, that's also unhelpful. So if you are, prone to this emotional empathy, you can fall into empathy overload, is the best way to say it. Like, you can feel everything that everybody's feeling. People tell you things and you feel it, and then people tell you things. It's not always healthy. So, but we have talked about how to manage that. We may talk more about how to manage that later, but it is manageable. It's great to feel those things, but not to the point where it overwhelms you. Healthcare professionals usually do a great job at this. because they are able to empathize. They're able to come in the room, talk to you about that, but then they're able to kind of shake it off and balance it and go on to the next patient. Now, I don't know what they're doing in their current situation. I know because of all that's going on with COVID and everything, a lot of healthcare professionals are overwhelmed and burnt out, and all I can do is pray for them, but you take on those emotions, and knowing how to maintain that balance is vital. I remember even when I worked in the credit union, I had different positions in credit unions, but one of my positions, I was very face-to-face with members, always dealing with the members in credit unions. We call our customers members because they're part owners, but I don't want to get into a credit union spiel. I'm pro-credit unions because it's all about people helping people. But in my credit union experience, there were times where there was empathy overload, and I have to admit that. It becomes, when you're dealing with people's finances is a major thing for them. So if I would have to deal with things back to back where people couldn't get loans, or negative things were happening, or there was a death and we had to figure out how to manage these finances, but there was no insurance, there was a point where it could be emotional overload. But if you get overloaded and are only driven by that emotional empathy, then you can find yourself with an inability to help. And like I said, men are more prone to the cognitive empathy. Women are more prone to the emotional empathy. They will feel first before they think. Men will generally think first before they feel. So it's just about understanding that, not necessarily changing that, because we're wired that way purposefully, but making sure that we manage it on both ends to bring it into balance so we have healthy social relationships. So, so that we can always learn how to relate to each other and understand that some of it's just part of our wiring, and knowing where to compensate and where to maneuver when we need to. All right, the third type of empathy is compassionate empathy. All right, this is feeling someone's pain and taking action to help. It's feeling the concern, but with an action. Okay. Remember, the cognitive was understanding perspective, not really any feeling, and may or may not have action. The emotional empathy is great because you're feeling, but it may or may not have action. It may have action, but sometimes the emotions can overwhelm you and incapacitate you so that you can't make any actions. But this compassionate empathy is the great balance. It's what we're looking for. So it's feeling the concern, but with action, okay? If you just feel concern for people and there's no action or no desire for action, that's not real empathy. Okay, so compassionate empathy is really consistent with what we would term compassion, plain and simple. What we know and understand to be compassion, that's really what compassionate empathy is. So compassionate empathy is the right balance between the logic, the cognitive, and the emotion, okay? So it's the right balance of both, so it's great. And that's where we want to be. That's where we want to stay. Even if we're prone to one of the others, we want to be able to maneuver ourselves into compassionate empathy. And remember, compassion always requires an action. If you're compassionate, there's going to be an action that follows. And sometimes it can't always be physical action, but there's some type of action that follows. Okay, I'm going to give you a couple of examples and then talk about just a few more things. My mother was a very, very compassionate woman. She always helped other people. There were always people in our house. I was never shocked to come home and there were other people in our house. On occasion, other people living in our house. But usually, I get in the car after church, there were extra people in the car. My mother was always helping. She was very, very compassionate. I remember specifically one time we heard a baby crying. We heard the sounds of a baby crying outside of our door in the middle of the night. And I remember our mother woke us up and she said, "There's a baby outside, and I'm just letting you guys know that I'm going to bring this baby in, and whatever that means, we're going to take care of this baby." She woke us up to tell us because she's very compassionate. Come to find out, it was just a cat. Okay, so she went outside and it was a cat. Yes, she started feeding the cat and all of that. But I'm just telling you the mindset that my mother was fully prepared to take this imaginary baby into our home and care for it because she was moved with compassion. It wasn't just I feel for it, but I'm going to do something. I'm going to feel and do, okay? I'll give you another example of my mother. Such a wonderful woman. I remember us being in L.A., it had to be, I can't even say the year, but because I don't know. But we were young, and I believe it was my mother and my father and me and my sister Deborah in the car. We were in L.A. and we were driving around. My parents like to go for drives. Can't imagine that my brothers weren't there. They probably just didn't go with us on that drive. But it was me and my sister in the car with my parents, and my parents just like to drive. So they wanted to drive and kind of see the lay of the land. I think we were at a convention or something. I'm not sure, or maybe just on vacation. Wanted to see the lay of the land, and we wanted to drive, and my mother wanted to drive into the not great part of town, maybe not the touristy area, but maybe the questionable area, maybe the area that we wouldn't go. My mother wanted to drive down there, and my father just loved my mother, so whatever. She said, who cares? So he was just driving through this not so great area of town, and my mother sees someone that appears to be homeless, and she tells my father to stop the car. My father, being wise and married for several years, just stopped the car. He didn't ask any questions. He just stopped the car. My mother perceives, I cannot remember specifics because I was very young, I probably about 10, but I remember, and I don't know if you all remember this, but they used to have something at a certain bank called Mad Money, where there was a stack of ones, either in 25s or 50s, that they put in a little case that looked like a checkbook. And our parents would get those for us when we went out of town because, back then you needed quarters for stuff. Quarter can't buy you anything now. But it was very nice to have those crisp dollars to make change for arcades or vending machines or video games, all that kind of stuff. So my mother had one of these stacks of Mad Money. And I can't remember if she got out the car or if she called the person to the car. She proceeded to pull out this stack of ones. Granted, it was just ones, but she proceeds to rip off this money in front of this person and just give them the cash. My father, this is what I remember, and I'll talk to my sister to see if my memory is accurate, but I just remember my father just being like, almost horrified because he felt it wasn't safe. It wasn't, it wasn't really, he didn't know the environment and he wants to protect his family. And he's like, what is happening? And she did it so quickly that there was no time to respond. But she felt compelled because she saw someone in need to take action. And that inspires me. And whether it was wise or not, I mean, the fruit is that there was no issue. So either she knew she was led by compassion, she was led by the Spirit. She knew what she was doing and giving, but she was moved by compassion. And there was nothing that was going to stop her act of compassion, regardless of what we thought. She didn't ask us. She didn't ask permission. Can we stop? Do you all feel this way? She moved with compassion to action. And that comes to my mind a lot because a lot of times you'll just see someone on the side and you don't know if they're homeless and, you don't know what their situation is, and they might have a sign, they need food, and we come up with these judgments. Oh, they're an addict. Does that mean they don't need food if they are? We just come up with these judgments and we aren't moved to help. So it's inspiring for me now to even think about that action of my mother just being moved to help. And that's one of the things that I think is lacking in our society, which shows that we are not empathetic, because empathy means that you're moved to action. So I mean, I'm going to give another example. I'm getting to Jesus because we talk about somebody who was so compassionate. His entire life was filled with compassion. I'm going to give you a quick example of that. But I question, why don't we have compassion and why don't we want to help others? I've come up with a few things, and this is a very limited list. But one thing is I feel like Cain felt in his regard to his brother Abel, we don't think we're our brother's keeper. And that's just not true. We don't feel that we have to help those that we maybe don't agree with or don't look like. We feel like we don't have to help them, or if they're not in our same situation. Is it my responsibility to know where he is? Yes, you are your brother's keeper. Another reason I think we don't understand that we are all connected and came from one man. We're so used to separating and segregating and putting ourselves in and different groups of people. Well, even in the church, I mean, you know, you've got Baptist versus Protestant, versus charismatic versus non-denominational. I mean, whoo, it is insane, but we don't understand. We all came from one man, whether we agree on how the man got here or not, whether by divine intelligence and the creation of God, we all came from Adam. So how separate can we be? How are we not connected? How does what happens to you not affect me? But we miss that understanding because we have become so individualized. Even in our country, we fight for our individual rights, which is not a bad thing. But when we discount and dismiss that there is a unity and we are all connected and there's a community, first of all, that we were created into and that we live in and that we're connected with, we lose sight of that, the fact that we need to help each other. I think another reason we don't help each other is because, as the Bible says, we have to love our neighbor as ourselves. So there's a couple of things here that could be a factor. Number one, we could be confused about who our neighbor is. I think sometimes Christians believe that only other Christians are their neighbors. Only other Christians that go to their church because they're in competition with the church down the street. Only other Christians that go to church in person and don't wear a mask. Those are the only people that are our neighbor. We get confused about who our neighbor is. We don't understand who our brother is, who our neighbor is, that we're all combined. Or if we're going with the love your neighbor as yourself, or the other reality is that you just don't really love you. Because how we treat other people is a reflection of how we feel about us. So sometimes we got to examine. We're so harsh. We're so judgmental because we're harsh with ourselves and judgmental with ourselves. All right. Let me say this. Helping others is powerful. I'm going to ask for about 7 more minutes, if that's okay, everyone. Helping others is powerful. There is such power in helping other people. There's 2 things I can specifically say, and there's other benefits, of course, but one thing, when you help someone else, one benefit that you get is that it recalibrates your emotional state. We're talking about emotional intelligence overall. And a lot of times when our emotions get out of balance, a lot of times when those few times that I have experienced depression, one of the ways I get out of it is by helping somebody else deliberately, on purpose, with intention, employing and engaging my will to help somebody else, and that'll snap me out of a depression. It'll recalibrate my emotional state. Helping others and seeing other people blessed brings joy to me. So it helps in that. It helps maintain that emotional intelligence, grow and increase that emotional intelligence and maintain that emotional balance. Another thing that help does is it resolves conflict. I mean, there have been times where I remember a specific instance at work where I had a particular manager who did not like me because I was vocal, and she did not like me. And then the tables turned when she had something that I helped her with. I wasn't mad at her. She had done some not nice things to me. I wasn't mad at her. I helped her. And when I helped, I could feel her heart turn. I was fine. I was unbothered. But when I helped her, I felt the conflict resolved. I'll give you a great example of this that I witnessed again a couple of weeks ago. I was watching Karate Kid 2. Let's talk about Mr. Miyagi and Sato. Okay, Mr. Miyagi and Sato. They had this conflict. Now, they were both about 164 in this movie, okay? So they were older, and they had this age-old conflict for years and years and years and years. Mr. Miyagi had left the country to get away from this conflict. So this conflict would have led to death. He didn't want to be a part of this conflict. And he had to come back because his father was dying, and he wanted to be there when his father died. Lo and behold, he stepped back 100 years later, and the conflict is still going on because Sato is still mad, right? But what happens and what resolves the conflict when their village becomes endangered by a storm that is coming and people need help? What happened was Sato got hit by a big piece of timber. That's the best way I can describe it because I don't know anything about construction. But it was resting on him and he could not get away, and he was going to be crushed and he was going to perish. And Mr. Miyagi runs out. I know this is fictional, but hopefully you've all seen Karate Kid too. Mr. Miyagi runs out and he helps him and he aids Sato. And when he helps Sato and saves Sato's life, instantly the conflict was over. And I know that was a fictional example, but it was such a good example, but it has real truth in it. When you help somebody else, if there's been ongoing, long-lasting conflict, that conflict can instantly be resolved because something opens up in the heart when that empathy is displayed, when that compassion, that's really what we're talking about, that compassionate empathy is displayed. So be like Mr. Miyagi today. Help somebody, help your neighbor, help your enemy. The Bible tells us to pray for our enemies, to do good to those that persecute you. Sometimes the result of that doing good is that the conflict is resolved. Not all the time, but on occasion, there are instances when doing good to that enemy or that person that hurt you or that person that despitefully used you will bring resolution, because you still have to empathize with the place where that person is coming from. So let me end with this. If you read in the Gospels, Jesus was full of compassion. And remember, when we talk about compassion, that's really what I'm talking about, compassionate empathy. It's a different terminology, same premise, same meaning. So we see so many examples where the Gospels say Jesus was moved with compassion, so he fed the multitude. He was moved with compassion, so he healed. I know a lot of times we say faith moves God. Yes, compassion moved Jesus to minister to people because he had great social skills, right? Because he was concerned about interpersonal relationships. He was concerned about people. Jesus always got in it. That's one thing I think we have to understand. Jesus was always willing to get his hands dirty. He was willing to go to places that other people didn't want to go. He was willing to get right in the thick of it to help. Just like my mother did when she deliberately asked us to drive to the shady neighborhood. I don't know if that was her purpose in her heart to help. She wanted to see. She wanted to get in. She didn't want to just be a spectator and watch from afar. She wanted to get hands-on. Jesus was so hands-on. The places that other people didn't want to go, because he was criticized for who he hung out with. Well, he was hands-on. And his desire, because he was so full of compassionate empathy and compassion, is that he always wanted to help others. So he wanted to be in the thick of it. He didn't want to be an outsider. He wanted to be a participant. So you see so many instances, and you can look through it. If you just search compassion in the Gospels, it'll show you how Jesus was moved with compassion. It'll say he had compassion. It talks about the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan was commended because he moved with compassion. The other people that passed by, the person who had been beat up didn't have any compassion. The Good Samaritan was celebrated because of his compassion. But I want to bring this one instance out to us in Mark chapter 5, and you have to read what goes on before it. It's the peace be still. The storm is raging. They're trying to get to the other side. Remember, Jesus is trying to get to the other side to help somebody that's demon possessed and kind of cray-cray. So he's going across to help, and all this other stuff happened. He's not deterred. He gets there. Long story short, he releases the demons from this person, and this person is now free. Okay, he did all that to help. The person is free. And then we get to verse 18 in Mark chapter 5. It says, and when he got to the boat, he who had been demon possessed, remember Jesus had healed him, so he was no longer demon possessed, but he was very grateful for Jesus and wanted to go with him. So, and when he got to the boat, he who had been demon possessed begged him that he might be with him. However, Jesus did not permit him, but he said to him, go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he has had compassion on you. Now, I found this interesting because a couple of series ago, we talked about how Jesus was sometimes secretive. Sometimes Jesus would do miracles and he would say, okay, don't tell anybody. Okay, and we see several instances of that. But in this instance, he says, go home to your friends, tell them what great things the Lord has done for you. And this is interesting to me, how he has had compassion on you. So don't just tell them what happened. Tell them what was behind what happened. Tell them the motivation for what happened. Tell them that compassion was the thing that was the catalyst for this great miracle. It's in verse 20 says, and he departed and began to proclaim in Decapolis all that Jesus has done for them, and all marveled. Now, it doesn't say that he mentioned the compassion. He told him what he did, but did he tell him the motivation? And I think sometimes we get so caught up in what people do or the end game that we miss the motivation. And sometimes maybe because he proclaimed the miracle but not the motivation, people didn't realize how important compassion is. But today I want to proclaim the motivation. So I'm going to pick up in verse 20 where this young man left off, and I'm going to tell you about the compassion that Jesus has for you in your current situation. I'm going to tell you that your God, Jesus, is full of compassion and ready to move on your behalf. That's what I'm going to proclaim today. And because that he is a God of compassion and I am made in his image and in his likeness and I'm just like him, I can move by that same compassion. I can flow in the compassion that Jesus flowed with. We want to flow in the miracles, and that's a great thing, and that's a great thing to desire. But do we want to flow in the compassion? I would submit to you that the compassion needs to flow before you see that outpouring of miracles that you've been looking for. I hope this has helped someone. Father, we just love you. We bless you. We thank you, Lord God, even as we're learning further about our emotional intelligence, that we have been heightened to look at the area of compassion. Compassion that, Jesus, when you were on the earth, you moved with, you healed with, you delivered with, you blessed with, you just had compassion and ate with people and fellowship with them. All those things were acts of compassion. We thank you that you are a very hands-on God. You are a God who gets in and helps and doesn't mind getting his hands dirty to be a part of the action because you are motivated by helping others, and we thank you for that. So, Father, we want to have that example. We want that to be our testimony as well, even the places where we have maybe been out of balance in our empathy, and maybe we've been overwhelmed by the emotional aspect of our empathy, or maybe we've been disconnected from our emotions altogether and just have cognitive empathy. Bring us into that place of balance where we can display the compassionate empathy that you displayed when you walked the earth. And we just thank you for it, and we bless you. In Jesus' name, amen.